So everyone got the way to evacuate, right? That's an auspicious introduction, you know, telling you how to get away before the talk even starts. So they asked me to come and do a talk about best management practices for pruning. So this talk could also be seen as introduction to pruning. So who is a certified arborist here? Okay. So some of you, this will be a lot of review is my guess. There's a few things that are kind of newer in here, but mostly we're just going to focus on what the best practices are for pruning trees and then talk a little bit about structural pruning at the end, I hope. As most of you are aware, you know, pruning is kind of a deep topic. There's all these rules that we have on the surface, kind of shallow things. But there's also a lot of nuance and a lot of things that takes a lot of experience to really master. So if you're interested in a deeper level than this talk goes, there are several other talks later in the week. The ISA has trainings, and there are outside speakers coming, and I hope you'll attend those too. So without further ado, for those of you who aren't aware, GreenCo, which is the industry trade group for the green industries of Colorado, has a very good set of best management practices on their website, which cover pretty much any topic in landscape maintenance that you can think of, from irrigation management to pruning to just anything you can imagine. And under their section for pruning, they refer to two other organizations or documents. The first is the ANSI standards, the 300 standards to be precise. Part 1 of those covers pruning, and then they just refer to the ISA. Okay, so that's kind of a broad reference. But so what we're going to talk about in this talk is pulled either from the ANSI standards, from the ISA, or there's some stuff brought in from Ed Gilman's book, An Illustrated Guide to Pruning, as well, which is a great resource to have if you're working in the tree care industry. So I think a good place to start start a discussion about pruning is to talk about why we prune trees. Whenever I look at this picture, I see something different. You know, at first I was like, oh, geez, just what an idiot. And then you look, he's smiling. Like, what's that about? He's got this log between his legs. I don't know what's going on necessarily. But the reason he may have been pruning this tree, and maybe it was an insurance deal, I don't know. But I think it's a valid question to ask, right? I mean, in a forest, trees do just fine without people pruning them, without humans pruning them most of the time. But in landscapes, it's a different story. And a lot of that has to do with the difference between a landscape and a forest setting. And the most obvious part of that is that a landscape is a designed, managed setting, right? And so we want our trees to fit into that design. We don't want them to, we want them to be less wild, I guess. So we prune them to fit better in the landscape, right? We keep them under power lines, over sidewalks, away from buildings. We prune them so they aesthetically fit in the landscape better. We get rid of dead wood. We balance the canopy so it looks nicer. Maybe we prune it in a way that encourages flowering, things like that. We also prune them to fit in the landscape safety-wise, right? If there's a tree which we think has a greater risk of failure, we prune it to alleviate that risk, to make it fit better in the landscape. So that's one reason. The other reason that I find more interesting is that has to do more with the difference between a forest and a landscape. In a forest, right, the trees are growing fairly densely. They're close together. There's a lot of competition for sunlight, so trees are encouraged to grow straight, right, straight towards the sunlight. They don't tend to have a lot of large lateral branches. They tend to have a more vertical form. And it turns out that, you know, over time, evolution has led the trees to, I don't want to say comfortable with that form, but when they grow in an open landscape where there's sunlight from all around, they tend to get a more spreading habit, right, with larger side branches, things like that, which makes them more prone to failure because they're not adapted to that. They're adapted to growing in a forest situation. So those are really the reasons most trees actually, you know, almost need pruning in a landscape to avoid failure. So that leads us into our first management practice, which is prune with an objective. The ones I've given here are the objectives from the ANSI standards. You'll read other lists that vary a little bit from this. I'm not going to go through them all because we only have an hour today and it's not that exciting. But you know, the first one, reduce risk of failure. That, to me, that encompasses things like structural pruning, right? We're long-term reducing the risk of failure, perhaps dealing with hazard trees. Or, you know, here we have an example of included bark, right? That's a structural defect, and so we prune to reduce the risk of failure. We prune for clearance, right? We got to keep signs clear, sidewalks clear, line of sight, and things like that. That's important. Sometimes we prune just to improve the health. This is fire blight. It's not the best picture, I guess, but we prune fire blight out as part of the management of that disease. Or we prune deadwood out to improve a tree's health. And finally, there's a whole bunch of these things that kind of fall together to me as kind of special considerations, right? We might prune a tree just like this espalier here just because we like it aesthetically, or it encourages fruit production, or something like that. But no matter why we're pruning a tree, we should be doing it with a specific objective in mind, because pruning, as most of you probably know here in this room, is a double-edged sword, right? There are negative consequences to a tree when we prune it. One is that when we prune the tree, it's just another form of wounding it. It's a controlled form of wounding the tree, right? So we're creating wounds which allow decay organisms into the heartwood of the tree, the structural wood of the tree. So we don't want to be just doing it willy-nilly. We want to be doing it with the purpose. In the picture here, you can see the discolored areas. These are areas where decay organisms have gotten in through these wounds, bacteria and fungi. So that's one reason, pruning is a double-edged sword, so we need to do it with an objective. Pruning also, if you read a textbook, they say reduces the energy state of a tree, which is way fancy sounding to me. I mean, really, when you prune a tree, you're essentially lowering its potential for creating future energy, because those leaves that you pruned off were going to do photosynthesis and create energy for the tree. Or if the tree was dormant, the buds that you pruned off were going to become leaves and do photosynthesis. So you're reducing the amount of energy the tree can potentially make. We all know that plants or trees, that they store energy in their roots, but they also store a lot of energy in the sapwood of the tree in the form of starches. And so when you prune off a branch, all the energy the tree banked into that branch is lost. It's like, you putting money in the bank and then the bank going belly up and it's just gone. It's got to be a frustrating experience. And then finally, when you prune the tree expends energy to fight decay, to create wound wood, to close the wound, to repair embolisms. Actually, so those are bubbles in the vascular tissue of the tree, right? When we prune it, we are letting air into the vascular system, and the tree can't function with air in the vascular system. It can't move water and nutrients up and down properly, so it uses energy to fix those embolisms. So there are a lot of negative consequences for pruning, and if we do pruning, if we improperly prune, like in this example, this tree is kind of topped with heading cuts, and all the apical dominance is released, right? We get a lot of secondary branching, we get a lot of competing branches. Improper pruning can actually hurt the structure and set you back. So we always prune correctly and with an objective, because improper pruning or pruning without a purpose is very bad for the tree. So that's kind of my lead up here. Now we're going to actually get into some of the management practices. And we're going to start off with kind of general things. So this is kind of the how much. It's probably a lot of review for those of you who are arborists, but it's important stuff. So first is the time of year, and in our part of the country, probably early spring is really the best time of year to prune a tree. At that point, the tree's energy reserves are high, so it has a lot of energy to do things like fight decay, to put out new growth, to create wound wood. And also all those those systems that do those things, that create wound wood and et cetera, are all just primed to go in the spring. That's the time they're most active, so they're all ready to fight decay right then. So that's probably why it's the very best time, is to do it in the early spring before a tree leaves out. That said, there's research that says that probably doing small pruning, like branches that are less than an inch and less than 10% of the living tissue of the tree, that can be done anytime without major ramifications. And trees will tolerate pruning other times of the year. It's just early spring is best in a perfect world, which none of us live in. And if you're pruning a tree that tends to bleed sap and that's an issue, first of all, that's not an issue for the tree. There's good research that shows that sap bleeding from pruning wounds, it makes no practical difference to the tree's health. But aesthetically, it can sometimes be upsetting for clients, right? They don't like to see it. And then on top of that, it can attract nuisance insects, and in some settings, that's a problem. So if you're pruning a species of tree that you know bleeds, you can put off pruning till right after the flush of spring growth. That would be the next best time to do it. Other times of year, the disadvantages of some of those, so midsummer, even in irrigated landscapes, a lot of our shade trees are under stress midsummer. And so if you're pruning the tree, I already kind of highlighted why it's stressful for the tree. If you're pruning it when it's already under stress, it's not going to respond to the pruning as well. It's not going to fight decay as well. It's not going to close wounds as well. all that stuff. So midsummer trees tend to be stressed out when it's 100 degrees, for 2 weeks, even when they're irrigated. Late in the fall, if you prune too late in the fall, you might, especially heavy pruning, you can encourage a flush of new growth, which may or may not harden off before a frost. So that's the reason early or late fall is probably not a good time. And winter, if you prune, especially during a very cold spell, we're getting sub-zero temperatures, below freezing temperatures in the winter, you predispose the tree to frost cracks. You may kill living tissue near the cut that wasn't acclimated to those cold temperatures. So, it seems that's a lot of talk for a simple management practice, right? Prune in the spring if possible, the early spring if possible. So the next kind of question is, how much should we prune? And you'll read different things, different places. The ANSI standards just say 25% of the living tissue maximum. Dr. Ed Gilman's book says 25% from a medium-aged tree, and it says up to 50% for a young tree. But most sources agree that I would say when I say most sources agree, I mean all credible sources pretty much agree that when you're pruning an older tree, that the pruning should be kept to what is a minimum that needs to be done, and 10% is probably a good maximum. The reason for that is, and the deeper discussion about the dosage, about how much to prune from the tree, is that since pruning is stressful for a tree, if a tree is under stress, we want to prune it as little as possible, right? We don't want to compound any stress that's under. So if we're in a drought, we should probably be lowering the dosage. If the tree is as recently transplanted, probably should be lowering the dosage. If the tree is older trees are predisposed to stress. You think about all that living tissue that they have to maintain to transport water and nutrients up and down the tree. It takes a lot of energy to keep all that living tissue alive. So they're predisposed to stress, so we don't prune them as much. A lot of that depends on the tree's health and the tree's structure. If you have a healthy older tree that has good structure, you're probably just going to do cleaning and not much else. If you have a healthy older tree with poor structure, you may do some pruning to remediate that structure. If you have an older tree that is in poor health and has poor structure, you're probably talking about a specialized type of pruning, like some sort of restoration pruning and some sort of program to help restore that tree. I have the picture up here of, so I said if a tree's under stress, we should prune it less. And so the next question is, how do we judge that? Well, one way, which is pretty good, but maybe not as good as we once thought, is to look at the growth increments of the tree. So if the growth increment is the first one is from the bud back to a ring around the branch, and on some trees it's really obvious, and some it's not so obvious. Generally, if that increment is 12 inches or more, the tree is probably in good enough health to prune to the full 25% of the dosage. And the shorter it is, the shorter it is below 12 inches, probably the less we should be pruning. So I think that's all I really wanted to get into for that one. So the question that really goes hand in hand with dosage is the pruning schedule. How often should we be pruning a tree? And you can see those things are related, right? If you're pruning the tree every year, you're probably going to be able to get away with a lower dosage. You'll take less out of the tree because you're pruning it every year. In a perfect world, for young and medium-aged trees, we'd be pruning them every year so we could keep that dosage low, to keep the stress on the tree lower. In the real world, that just doesn't happen. I mean, it can, but in a lot of situations, it doesn't happen. So what ends up happening is we push the dosage a little higher, which is okay to do, but you understand you're putting more stress on the tree, and we prune them less often. But ideally, for the best management practice, we would prune young to middle-aged trees annually. That would be best in a perfect world. For mature trees, it's a lot trickier. We already kind of talked about some of the complications with that, right? If it's a mature tree in good health with good structure, you may not prune it that often. If it's a good tree with poor structure, you may prune it a little bit annually to try to improve that structure or mitigate some of the defects. If it's a tree that's in poor health and with poor structure, it gets a lot more complicated. And we could have a whole class on restoration pruning, but you're going to have to probably undergo a more specialized and more in-depth pruning regime on that. So then the final piece of this is that for a while, up until maybe 10 years ago, there was a big kind of The recommendation was not to prune at planting because it put stress on the tree, it slowed root growth because hormones produced in buds encourage root growth. So pruning off buds at planting would discourage root growth and slow establishment, and that's probably true to some extent. But I think that the thinking is now shifted to where we think it's probably best practice to do some structural pruning at planting to take care of any codominant stems, things like that at planting, even if it means a little bit slower establishment. Nurseries prune trees vigorously, all the time when they're in the nursery and they tolerate it. They probably can tolerate losing a codominant branch or two at planting in the landscape. So, the last little note about these general BPMs, wound dressing, you don't see much wound dressing done anymore. It used to be an extension agent who got up to give this talk 15 years ago would have recommended it. Now there's been a lot of good research that pretty much all says that wound dressings are not beneficial. They don't have any benefit to the tree. They don't help keep decay out, things like that. And in many cases, they're harmful. They prevent the formation of wound wood. They keep the wound from closing. They can actually trap moisture in the heartwood and sapwood, which is an area where we pretty much want dry. And in some cases, especially if you're using an oil-based paint, it can kill plant tissue. So, it's probably not a great thing for the tree. There are some cases for very specific diseases, none of which are an issue in Colorado, really, where we would use some sort of dressings, a fungicidal dressing or an insecticide, actually a repellent. For oak wilt, they use it to keep the insects that vector the disease, to discourage them from getting into the tree. But in Colorado, those aren't really issues for us, so generally not something to do. And if you have a client who just insists upon you using a dressing, the best one you can use, the one that does the least harm, is a water-based paint. So if they're going to insist upon it, a water-based paint type dressing is the one to use. But generally, we don't need them. So that's kind of it for the general BPMs. Now, the rest of the talk, I'm going to get into, we're going to talk about BPMs for pruning cuts, the different types of cuts, and how to best execute them, when to use them we'll talk about a little bit. And then we're going to talk a little bit about best management practices for structural pruning. So in terms of pruning cuts, we already said that pruning cuts are another form of wounding the tree. So they're pathways for decay, and so it just makes sense that we're going to want to make them in a way that minimizes the potential for decay, if there is a way to do that, and there is. So there are some general rules. Generally, smaller cuts are safer, especially if you're making a cut in a branch that doesn't have a branch collar. And if you don't know what a collar is, we'll get into that in a second. But 2 to 4 inches, depending on the species and the exact type of cut you're making, is the safest. Oftentimes, we have to push that higher in the real world, but that is what the research has said is the absolute safest. Just a note, because I see it all the time and it frustrates me when you see a branch like this where someone made a cut and they just got a little sloppy at the end of it and they damaged the bark of the tree. You just nicked the tree at a point where it has no system to control the decay, trying to make a good cut. So be careful with the saws. That's not a little thing. That's a big thing for the tree if you are nicking them like that. And beyond pruning, I just have to mention too, anything that damages the bark, whether that's when you're climbing the tree or doing groundwork around the tree, anything that damages the bark has the potential to let decay into the tree, and it can negate all the careful work you do making a correct pruning cut. And those are little things that are just attention to detail sort of things that you can do. So, and the biggest management practice to control decay is to make cuts on branches that have collars and make them just outside the collars. So here's an example. I got this from the internet because for the life of me, at the trees around my work, I cannot find a good branch collar. I was out there with a camera in the snow looking for one. So I stole this from the internet because it really shows the collar. The collar is that swollen area where a smaller branch, that usually shows up where a smaller branch meets a larger branch. And in particular, it shows up when a branch that's half the size, the smaller branch is half the size of the larger branch or smaller. And why that area is swollen, and this is just a bit technical, but I think it's interesting, so I'm going to go into it, is it's actually not totally understood, but they do have a very good working theory, is that, so that small branch is doing photosynthesis, right? It's making sugars, and it's sending them down the branch to the trunk. But where the smaller branch meets the larger branch, there is kind of a restriction in the vascular system. The cells aren't lined up perfectly. something like that. So it slows down. The sugars slow down and accumulate right there at the base of the branch. So there's a lot of energy right there to do secondary growth, to put out wood. And the wood actually, there's so much growth actually that it overlaps onto the parent branch. And then eventually, though, that backup clears and the sugars flow through the parent branch, and then it starts growing. And so it puts out a lot of growth on top of the wood that the lateral branch had put out. So the wood is overlapping like that. I just find that fascinating, that just happens, and makes this strong union at the spot where the tree most needs a strong union. I just think it's crazy. But anyway, so there's overlapping tissue there. So that does a couple things in that area. The tissue is denser, which makes it harder for fungi to penetrate. That's a big thing. It's denser. The pathways to the vascular tissue are not straight and easy. They're kind of convoluted. So it's harder for fungi to get through there. The other thing is that within that collar, a specialized set of tissues form called the branch, that we refer to as the branch protection zone. And these tissues can produce anti-decay chemicals, resins, terpenes, things like that. And so they actually, decay is actually controlled through putting out like decay-resistant substances there. So you can see this is why we want to keep this intact when we're pruning. If you're pruning on a branch that has a collar, you want to make a cut at the dotted line just outside of it, and we'll get more into that here in a second. So, taking a step back, discussing what a collar is, if we think about a branch union, there's only so many ways it can be configured, right? Either we have a situation where a large branch meets up with a small branch, right? It's a parent branch and a lateral branch, and we prune off the smaller branch, right? Or we have a situation, in that same situation, we could prune off the larger branch and leave the smaller branch. That's a reduction cut. Or if they're equal size and we prune off one, that's also a reduction cut. Or we could just go ahead and make a cut right in the middle of one of the branches, not at the junction. And if we do that at a bud or a node or something like that, we call that a heading cut. If you make a cut in the middle of the branch that's not at a bud or a node, it's just called you messed up. So we're going to just talk a little about these type of cuts. So first we're going to talk about a removal cut. Now this is taking a smaller branch back to a larger one. It is the safest type of cut to make decay-wise, and it has kind of a low to medium chance for decay depending on if there's a collar. If there's a collar, that's the low chance of decay. If there's not a collar, that's a higher chance for decay. So, the best management practice for this sort of cut, the biggest key is leaving the collar intact, and everyone's probably heard that in some other session or some other training before. But in this branch right here, you can see right here, there's a little bit of a swollen point, and the collar wraps around. I think I have a line. So this was a well-executed cut. It was just outside the collar. There's a little bit more to the mechanics of making a cut like this. So first thing is, if the branch is larger than an inch, it's recommended to use the three-step process. And this is not how I was taught the three-step process, but this is what is in Dr. Gilman's book, and I know it's being taught more. So the first step is to go about 12 inches out from the branch union and make an undercut about a third of the way through the branch until the saw just starts to barely bind. And then you come in after that and do an overcut directly above the undercut, and the branch, hopefully the branch snaps off and you've taken the weight off, and you come back with a cut just outside the collar to finish it off. Now what I was taught, and what is still a fine way to do it, is the overhang method, right, where you come under and then you go a few inches, like 3 to 4 inches down, and come in with your overcut there. And that's still perfectly fine. My understanding of it is that the reason they're recommending this method now is that there's less chance for the saw to bind and be pulled out of your hand. And that's what I've read. I've never had a saw bind on me doing the overhang method, but if you have, maybe this is something to consider. I think either way is fine, but the big key is getting the weight off that branch, because otherwise what can happen is the branch snaps halfway through and peels the bark down the tree with it as it goes. So that's why we take the weight off. If you've made a proper pruning cut, probably within a season or two, you'll see wound wood around the cut, like in the lower left of that picture, that is growing evenly, right? The wound wood is evenly growing around the cut. So, that's what, if you can see the collar, that's the way we do it. We do it just outside the collar. If you can't see the collar, you have to do a little trigonometry. It's not terribly complicated, but the procedure for making a removal cut when you can't see the collar is you draw an imaginary line parallel to the trunk that meets the bark ridge that develops between the parent and lateral branch. You draw an imaginary line, you look at the angle between the bark ridge, you look at angle A here between the bark ridge and your imaginary line, and you take its mirror angle on the other side and cut just outside of it. Again, that's probably a review for Ladia, but I did the drawing, so I wanted to put it in. So here's some examples, some poorly executed cuts. These are flush cuts. Obviously, they went straight up and down right through the collar. This one's kind of deceptive. You might think, well, maybe, but you can see the collar right here, and it's going off at an angle like that. So that was a cut through the collar as well. And it's kind of funny. It's interesting, you know, when you read accounts of pruning, how it was done 100 years ago. People didn't make flush cuts. Anyone want to guess why? Didn't have chainsaws, right? It was too much work. That's a longer cut to make, right? It's more pulling your saw back and forth than cutting directly through the branch. So kind of interesting to me anyways. Here's some examples of stubs being left. You know, you might say, what's the big deal? The branch collar is still intact, so what, I left a stub. But when you leave that deadwood there, that source of food for microorganisms right there, they can kind of build up a head of steam in that deadwood and may be able to make it through the collar and get into the trunk. So we want to leave as little wood as possible on the outside of the collar when we make a removal cut. So removal cuts are used for all sorts of things in pruning, as a lot of you I'm sure are aware. Over here, you know, it's for some thinning. Here in this tree, the red branches are coming off to raise it. You know, ideally we're going to use them for all those applications. They're used heavily in good structural pruning. But there are some things that they cannot do very well. And so one of them is reducing the size of a canopy. Like if you need to make a tree shorter or narrower, it's especially shorter, it's really hard to do with the removal cut. And so so for that application, we probably are going to use a reduction cut. It has other applications, not just reducing the size of the canopy, but that's definitely one. So this is when we're bringing a larger branch back to a smaller lateral branch. Because there's no collar where we make that cut, there's a much higher potential for decay. And depending on the species and the size of the cut, you're going to get decay anywhere from, you know, it could be from inches to feet behind that cut into the tree. So it's a cut that you think about twice before you make it, because there will be consequences, so you want to justify it. If you take off too much of a branch's mass with a reduction cut, or some species are just prone to it, you can get sprouting like in that lower picture. And, you know, I always just heard that, and I took it for granted that it happened, but it's kind of, you know, the reason that happens is you just removed a lot of leaf area, right? So the tree, in response, is trying to put out new shoots to do more photosynthesis, to get more energy. So if you remove, you know, depending on the species, the prescription varies, but if you remove too much of a branch with a reduction cut, you can get sprouting like that. In terms of the management practices for this cut, there's pretty good research shown that the lateral branch you make the cut back to needs to be at least a third the size of the parent branch in order to take over as a leader. That's a pretty standard rule. It's been around for a long time. I'm sure most of you know it. If it's smaller, you can get sprouting or dieback or just negative things for the tree. So you want to make sure the branch is large enough to take over. So reduction cuts, can be used both in reducing the size of the canopy, and they're very useful in structural pruning to suppress temporary branches, things like that, to help keep them a smaller size. And we'll talk about that here in a minute. So again, I was taught to make a reduction cut to this dotted blue line, which split the difference between an imaginary line through the stem and the branch stem ridge. There is very compelling research that actually the cut should be made at the dotted red line there, right? You want to keep the surface area of the cut as small as possible. There's no collar here to control decay, so we want as small a wound as possible. And if the branch is vertical, like in this example, you do put a slight angle to it so water will run off, so water will not pool on it, but you want it more flat than was taught to me, and I'm sure was taught to a lot of people. So there's a paper you can find. There's strong research that that's a better place to make a cut. So if the branch is more horizontal like this, then you just make it at the smallest part of the branch that doesn't leave a stub. You don't have to put any angle to it. So just directly perpendicular to the branch. And the final type of correct pruning cut is a heading cut. So in this case, we're cutting a branch back to a node or a bud or a branch that's less than a third the size of itself. So it's like or you could think of that as an improper reduction cut. There's a very high potential for decay with this sort of cut. If it's done incorrectly or you don't follow up on it, it can lead to very bad structure. It can lead to the release of apical dominance and a lot of competing branches that you then have to come back and thin out. And if you don't come back and thin them out, that's bad for the tree's long-term structure. And it's used mainly in nurseries, use it a lot in order to shape young trees. It's a very intensive system. And it can be used on leggy young landscape trees. But generally, this is the kind of cut that in most landscape trees you should avoid making. Okay, there are some situations, but you should avoid making it. It has a high potential for decay and a lot of negative consequences for the tree. It's more used in the very early stages of structural pruning. That's the best use for this cut. So this is just kind of a summary for your notes. Oh, and by the way, who downloaded the notes, by the way, or printed them out? Okay, a few people. That's an earlier version, and I apologize. There's a few typos in there. I think I put BPM like 6 or 7 times and went back and changed it to BMP, but ignore that. So the best management practice for pruning cuts, just a summary. When possible, you want to use removal cuts on branches that have a collar because of the low chance for decay. When reduction cuts are called for, the lateral branch that they're brought back to should be at least a third the size of the branch removed. And we want to avoid heading cuts in most landscape situations. So that was a lot of talking for 3 very simple points. And a final note about actually making pruning cuts. If you're removing a dead branch, you want to remove all the dead wood possible without taking off any living tissue. So to make it just outside the living tissue, do not damage the living tissue. The plant's already undertaking things to control decay there, and we really don't want to interfere with that or reintroduce decay. So we have the final section of this talk. We're going to talk a little about structural training. So this could be a whole 2-hour talk, structural training of shade trees, right? So this is very basic. This is introduction, and it's just going to kind of cover some of probably the most important practices to think about. So before we can begin a discussion about training for good structure, I think it's probably important to talk about what good structure is and why. I find if I understand why something is the good, then I'm more likely to follow through on that. So we'll talk a little about why. So first of all, what good structure is. So good structure is a single dominant trunk to the top or near the top of the canopy, depending on the exact type of tree you're dealing with. So in this example, it's near the top. This is more of a decurrent tree. Oh, wait, I'm getting confused. Anyways, near the top, and this one is to the top in my little drawings there. So we'll talk about why that is in 1 second. The other part of good structure, or one other part of good structure, is having strong branch unions. So we want the branches to have strong attachment. So we want the lateral branches to be half the size of the parent branch or less. That's a strong attachment because there's a collar there. We'll talk about that again in a second. We want branch angles that are horizontal. We want branches that go out, not up. And we'll talk about why that is here in a second. They used to think it was the angle of the actual union that was important. You needed a horizontal angle for the union. And I think there's pretty good research that suggests that the angle for the union doesn't matter so much as how the branch is oriented. So if it comes out sharply and then levels off, that's probably okay. There's been some research recently that kind of suggests that. So first of all, codominant branches are prone to failure. That's why we want a single dominant trunk to the top of the canopy. And that's for a number of reasons. One is that the unions between codominant branches are weak. In this case, we have included bark, right? This smooth connection here. All that's happening behind there is just bark touching bark. There's no strength to that. It's just bark resting against bark. So that makes the union weak. And what happens eventually, like this here at this ash split at 2 codominant trunks right outside the picture in a snowstorm 2 winters ago. So it was a defect, and that's where the tree failed. This is pretty near my office. Codominant trunks are also weak for a number of other reasons that we'll get into here if this goes forward. So codominant trunks tend to be, but not always are, very, very vertical. So vertical branches don't tend to have a lot of reaction wood. Reaction wood is a special type of wood put out by trees. It's different in conifers and angiosperms, but either way, its purpose is the same. It's a more structurally sound form of wood. In conifers, it's put out on the bottom of the branches, and we call it compression wood, and it pushes the branch out and holds it up from the bottom. In angiosperms, it's called tension wood. It's on the top, and it kind of holds it like a cord, right? It kind of holds a branch up and out. Horizontal branches have more of this sort of wood because they're always under, gravity is always pulling down on them, so they form more. Vertical branches, gravity pulls in them less. They have less of this sort of wood. So when they are loaded with snow or a windstorm or something, they're more prone to failure because they have this is the theory anyways. I'm not sure that there's some people who would tell you this is a theory and not 100% proven, but it makes sense to me, so I'm telling it to you. So codominant branches are often this way, but a branch does not have to be codominant to be vertical. So it's all vertical branches that don't tend to have this reaction wood, so they're more prone to failure. And then finally, lateral branches. A lateral branch that is less than half the size of the parent branch usually has a collar, so there's that overlapping dense wood, which makes it structurally stronger. That's why we want lateral branches to be small in relation to parent branches, because the connection is stronger. So that's like, if you took a class in arboriculture, that's like, a week's worth of lectures in 5 minutes. So anyways, hopefully that just kind of gives you some of the reasons why we really should care about good structure. There are reasons related to physics that good structure is important. So
when you're talking about the size of branches, are you talking about the caliber of the branch itself or the surface area? Two different things.
Yes, yeah. So when we talk about the size of branches, so when I say that when one branch is smaller than another, we're really talking about kind of the caliper of the branch. That's the idea, right? So if this larger branch was a 4-inch branch, we'd want this one to be 2 inches or less in size. Okay, good question. So I think that probably sums that up. So I have some examples in lovely drawings, and then I have some real-world pictures too. So the 2 trees on the outside have structural problems. They're young trees with structural problems. The one in the center has pretty good structure. So you can see codominant trunks, right? These trunks are competing for dominance. This tree, it's really prominent, right? Probably this branch we would like to be dominant, but these others are kind of starting to outcompete it. That's poor structure for the reasons we've discussed. In a real-world situation, here we have a very large ash tree, right? Green ash tree that has a lot of codominant branches, a lot of very large codominant branches, and it's survived quite a long time with that. And trees can, but it's a percentages game, right? When you have poor structure, the chance of failure is higher. This one beat the odds, but most of, the odds were not in its favor. So a younger tree that has a real problem with codominant branches, right? These are equal size. This one's probably a little straighter. We probably wish that something over here was dominant, but really this branch is kind of coming out on top, so to speak. So those are kind of real-world examples. I guarantee you, you walk through any landscape, you can find examples of this stuff. It's very common. Large lateral branches, I've circled some on here. They're often codominant as well. I'm missing a parenthesis there. I don't know where that went. So this tree has one that's kind of too large. There's a bunch in this one. Most of these, though, you can see are at least half the size or close to that of the parent stem. And then so in the real world, here we have an ash tree that has all sorts of other problems because it has this huge wound on it. But you can see these branches are pretty much the same in size, so the connection between them is going to be weaker. There's not going to be that overlapping of wood creating a strong connection. So its chances of failure are higher. Here in a honey locust, right, you can see it's hard. All these branches are pretty much the same size all the way up the tree. So this is a young tree where you might still be able to do something about it, but at this point, you'd probably say that's poor structure developing. Those branches are too large. Most of them are codominant as well. Something I didn't talk about in the first part of this is poorly spaced or clustered branches, which are a problem for a number of reasons. But when branches tend to be clustered around a single point, the force and load from a gust of wind is all distributed back to that point where they meet. So when the wind blows, you're putting all the stress on, not all the stress, but it's all being directed towards this one point on the trunk where all the branches meet. Increased risk for failure. We'd rather have the branches distributed so the load is distributed along the length of the tree, and the point of maximum load is at the base where you hopefully have a flare and the trunk is widest and strongest. So these trees have a few examples. Here's some real-world examples. This is a honey locust right out my office window. You can see all these branches are all meeting at the same spot. So you can imagine wind coming from this direction, right? All those branches are going to bend and distribute their force down to here. So it's a physics thing. It's an increased chance of failure. Here you have an ash tree, that had a white ash that has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and there was a sixth branch, all coming back to the same spot on the tree. Now it had survived, but again, it's an odds game, and this tree is beating the odds still. On the other hand, we have some examples of pretty decent structure. This tree has a few flaws, it's not perfect, this bur oak, but you can see most of the branches are at least half the size of the main trunk. They're fairly horizontal. We have some that are starting to get kind of vertical up here that probably should be dealt with, right, suppressed or removed, depending on the branch. Not a lot of codominance, right? There's a few that are starting to compete, but it's a much better example of a tree. Here we have a swamp white oak, and I think it's a really good example. You see these branches are very horizontal. They've been pruned in the past. You can even see where a pruning cut was made here to keep them, to suppress them and keep them small relative to the main trunk. And they're not made perfectly spaced, but the spacing is decent. There's probably a few that could come out of there, but that's more an example of good structure. So how do I fix it? Well, a lot of you, if you're certified arborists, are in the business of fixing stuff like this. I'm going to do a horrible job here in 30 seconds of showing how to prune these trees, when really we could have a big discussion about it if we were on a different topic. But so the two trees that needed pruning, what you want, kind of the perfect world scenario is that we use proper removal and reduction cuts to suppress large lateral branches, to suppress vertical branches, and maybe we do some removal cuts just to get rid of them if they're bad enough. So I'm highlighting in red what's about to come out of those pictures. You can see we've dealt with some of the codominant things, sometimes with reduction cuts, sometimes with some removal cuts to get the spacing better, removal cuts on the small stuff up here, and we end up with trees like this. And when I did this example, I didn't solve all their problems because of my pruning budget. So we're coming back to the top. In this tree I probably took off 20%, and this one it was probably more like 30 or 40. So there may be more that needs to be done there in future years, and there are certainly other ways you could have approached those trees, but you can see we've dealt with a lot of the issues. We've suppressed a lot of things, and hopefully we're on a better path. So, all right, so there are a few other just general structural best management practices we're going to go over here at the end of the talk. This is a picture from Ed Gilman's textbook, which is full of just really good pictures like this. It's totally worth the $45 that book is on Amazon. I don't know him. I'm not, trying to sell books for him, but it's really, the illustrations are really good. So when we're raising the crown, one mistake that's often made is that we raise them too rapidly. And sometimes it's because we can't get back to the tree. We know we're not going to be back there for a year or two, and so we raise it further than we know we should. But the research indicates that the best practice is to keep at least 60% of the height of the tree as crown. So 60% is leaves and foliage, and 40% is exposed trunk at a maximum percentage there. So in this example, this tree is about 80% crown to begin with, and they want to raise it. This is what not to do. Raise it up so it's only 40%. And this is bad for just a number of reasons. One, you expose all this trunk, all this trunk to direct sunlight. And do we have a problem with sun scald along the Front Range? Right, yeah. So when you expose all that trunk, you're just asking for problems with sun scald. So that's, damage from direct sunlight on the trunk. That's a whole different topic, but that can be a problem there. We've changed the whole physics of the way this tree acts in a windstorm. Now all the load is up here, the tree bends, and the majority of the stress is placed somewhere in the middle of the tree, right? Where the tree had not been creating secondary growth throughout its whole life to bear that stress. So bad for a number of reasons. what's better, and they show two approaches here, which I also love about Ed Gilman's textbook, is rarely in there does he go, this is right, this is wrong. There's always more than one way to approach it. So there's two approaches here. So in this example, they removed the largest lower branches, and they left a few to shade the trunk, and they still had a 70% crown ratio. So they did removal cuts to get rid of the big branches, left some smaller ones just for shading the trunk, and to provide and also these branches will provide some sugars for secondary growth in the main trunk. So that's kind of neat. And the other option is that they just did a lot of reduction cuts on those lower large branches to keep them smaller, and they'll come off the tree in a future year when the tree's taller. So there's more than one way to go about it, but the rule is we don't want is the 60% live crown ratio, right? We don't want to raise them further than that. Is that pretty clear? Okay. Some other structural BPMs, right? BMPs. I'm dyslexic. And most of these are things that don't happen near as much as they used to, which is really a credit to the arborists as a group. But you want to avoid topping a tree, just rounding it over with heading cuts or something like that. Here we have the same example from earlier, right? You round the tree over, so you remove all the terminal buds. Those terminal buds were producing auxin, which was suppressing all the lateral buds. Without that, all the lateral buds are released. They all become branches, and unless you come back and do more pruning to thin out these lateral branches that were released, you end up with just horrible structure, ugly tree, not desirable at all. So we want to avoid topping trees. We want to make instead proper removal and reduction cuts to control their size, if that's the goal. Okay? And then kind of the old, the old standard of bad pruning, the lion's tailing of a tree, right? So for those of you who aren't aware, they call this lion's tailing because you remove all the inward and downward growing branches, and pretty much everyone in this example, up to the very top of the tree. And when you're left with a little poof at the top that looks like the poof at the end of a lion's tail. It's literal. So this is, I did not actually see this tree. This is another photo I got from the internet because this doesn't happen that much anymore. It's harder to find examples of it than it used to be. So there's a lot of reasons not to do this. A lot of them relate to the physics of the tree right now. When wind hits the tree, all the force is pushed to the middle of these branches, more prone to failure. When you prune a tree that severely, you take off all those branches. I mean, it's just stressful for the tree, especially a mature tree like that. Probably going to start a cycle of decline. And then, of course, the bad arborists that did this assured themselves return business when they're called to remove it. So I'm being cynical. Okay, so, but lion's tailing doesn't always have to be this insidious. What I see more often, and what I'm ashamed to admit I have done when I worked a little bit in the urban forestry industry, is there's a form of lion's tailing that, while not as obvious, is almost as problematic. So when we don't want to get the ladder out to do something like sidewalk clearance, and we always just remove the downward growing branches just to keep them clear of the sidewalk, what happens is, here's our little example, a tree that's maybe 12 feet high. There's a person. If we always just remove the downward branches year after year, the branch gets longer and leggier, and it droops. And we have to remove the downward growing branches again. And it gets longer and leggier, and it droops. And we have to remove the downward branches again. Eventually, what we end up with are these long, droopy branches where there's a lot of weight very far out on the tree that are more prone to failure. They're very long. It's a long lever, right? So when force is applied to the end of them, they're more prone to break. So in a perfect world, we would, over time, take that same tree and we would suppress those lower branches with removal and reduction cuts. Year after year, we'd keep them smaller. And then eventually, when the tree was larger, we could take them off the tree with proper cuts, right? We wouldn't let them get so large relative to the main trunk. Just a pet peeve of mine, so I had to throw it in here. Because it is the same principle as lion's tailing, it's just not as complete, right? We're just stripping those branches out to their tips. It's the same principle. So that's one of my pet peeves, so I have to put it in there. So kind of just a summary, and this is more for your take-home for the handout is why I put this in here, but I'll go over it anyways. So the best management practice is, for good structure, we want to suppress or remove codominant branches to keep a single trunk to the top of the tree. We want to keep lateral branches half the size or less of their parent branches, again, by suppressing them with proper removal and reduction cuts, because that's a strong attachment. We want to suppress or remove more vertical branches, and we want to keep at least 60% of the tree crown. We want a 60% live crown ratio. And again, just those old bad pruning practices that we don't see that much anymore, we still want to avoid them, topping and lion's tailing. So those are kind of the main points. So finally, putting it all together here, I adapted this from we have a garden note CSU does on pruning. Garden notes are like expanded fact sheets. They're usually, they're a little more in depth. And so I adapted this from our resource, which I think there's a web address for in your handout. But when you're putting it all together, when you're going, okay, I can only prune out 20% of the tree in a given year, right? This tree this year. How do I allocate that 20%? This is kind of a system you can use to prioritize it. So the first thing we always do is get rid of any dead wood. That's free. Doesn't count against our pruning budget. Just get rid of it. And any branches that are rubbing each other or damaged, we get rid of, because those are, if they're rubbing and they're always damaging each other, that's a constant source of a wound that decay can enter, so we get rid of those. Those do count against our pruning budget. Then we do work to maintain a single dominant trunk to the top of the canopy. So in this case, we took out this competing one. This was kind of starting to compete, so we suppressed that branch. We did some suppression work on these. And if my budget was 20%, I've probably reached it after just doing these 4 on this side of the tree. I highlighted the other ones you could choose to do if the tree's healthy and you think it can take it that year. You think it's healthy enough, it's put out 12 or 14 inches of growth, and you think, okay, I can push it. But so that would be the next thing we could do. And if you still have pruning budget left, we would select, I don't know what that is. If you still had pruning budget left, we could start working on training our permanent branches and managing our temporary branches. So say this tree is 8 feet tall. Our first permanent branch probably isn't up till somewhere like here, right? So on a smaller tree, there may not be very little to do in terms of permanent branches, but say this tree was 12 feet tall, and maybe we decide that this is going to be a permanent branch. So we want to keep, once we've identified it as a permanent branch, we're going to try to keep it a smaller size relative to the parent branch. We're going to probably want to use less reduction cuts and more removal cuts because we don't want to let decay into it. And we're going to try to keep it growing more horizontally, directed more horizontally with our pruning. We don't have time to get as much into that as maybe I'd like to. So, and then finally, once you've kind of preened over your permanent branches and kind of treated them right and worked on them, then you start working on your temporary branches. You're either going to suppress them or remove them depending on what you have left in your pruning budget and where they are on the plant. That was, again, structural pruning. That was like half a semester in like 5 minutes. I feel kind of dirty about it. Okay, so putting this all together, structural pruning, you may not be able to address all the issues in 1 year. I kind of talked about that. This is I think this was a Zelkova I took a picture of, and they're prone to kind of have this multi-stem sort of habit. But if you go on a job and you come across this tree, you cannot get this tree to have good structure in 1 pruning, or probably 2 prunings or 3 or 4. You can work on it, but it's going to take more than 1 pruning. And the other thing is this really applies to small or the basal prune, yeah. So this really applies to smaller or mid-sized trees too, because we come across a cottonwood like this, it kind of is what it is. You might do some cleaning in this tree, you might do some structural work up top if you thought it was warranted, but you're not going to be able to structurally train this tree the way you would a young tree. So structural pruning obviously applies to younger and sometimes mid-sized trees. So most of you are certified arborists, asking you to raise your hand. When I give this talk to other groups, I tell them all to call you if they have problem trees, so that's what that last line's about.